Hi. Recently we talked about direct objects, which receive the action from the verb in a sentence. For instance, I baked a cake. I am the subject, baked is the verb, and cake is the direct object, since it's what got baked. Today let's talk about indirect objects. Indirect objects are a noun or noun phrase, or could be a pronoun, that is affected by the verb but is not the object of the verb. For instance, I could have said, I baked Joshua a cake. Now, what is the direct object? It's still the cake. The cake is still what got baked. The cake still receives the action of baking. But Joshua is affected. The cake receives the action of the verb, but Joshua receives the cake. The direct object receives the action of the verb, and the indirect object receives the direct object. Joshua received the cake, which was the direct object. As we've seen, we can have a direct object without an indirect one. I baked a cake. But if we have an indirect object, we must have a direct object. We can't say, I baked Joshua, period. Well, we could say we baked Joshua, but he would then turn into the direct object and we'd go to jail. Again, the direct object receives the action of the verb. The indirect object receives the direct object. Now, don't confuse indirect objects with prepositional phrases. I could have said, I baked a cake for Joshua. Joshua is still the recipient of the cake, still the recipient of the direct object. But he is not an indirect object. He is now part of a prepositional phrase for Joshua. He's the object of the preposition rather than the indirect object of the verb. The sentence still means the same thing, but the mechanics have changed. Indirect objects come after the verb and before the direct object. I baked Joshua a cake. As I said, your indirect object may be a phrase, so it may be more than one word. I gave the homeless man on the street $5. What's the direct object? What did I give? $5. So what or who is the indirect object? The homeless man on the street. He received the $5 or the direct object. So he, the homeless man on the street, is the indirect object. When an indirect object is a pronoun, it, just like direct objects, uses the object pronouns such as him, her, them, me. We don't use he, she, they, and I as direct or indirect objects. Now, if you yourself are the indirect object, you use the reflexive pronoun, such as myself, or himself, yourself, themselves, herself. For instance, I asked myself a question. Question is obviously what got asked, so it's the direct object. But I am the person who received the question. But I don't say I asked I a question, or I asked me a question even. I say I asked myself a question. I'm acting upon myself. Or he asked himself, or she asked herself. When I said I'm acting upon myself, but really I'm asking a question. That's the direct object. Myself is just receiving that object, the question. And by the way, in the same way, the direct object could also, just as the indirect object could be a phrase, the direct object could be a phrase, or a whole sentence even. For instance, I said I asked myself a question, but I could have said I asked myself, what in the world are you doing? That's what got asked. What in the world are you doing? It's the direct object. Myself is the indirect object. I receive the direct object or the question. Again, indirect objects don't receive the action of the verb. That's the direct object. Indirect objects are still affected by the verb, though. They receive the direct object. And I think that's it. Thanks for watching. Bye.